Applied Magic by Dion Fortune. Narrated by Matthew Schmitz. The Occult Field Today. The publication of two very important books on magic, The Tree of Life by Israel Regardie and Magic by the Master Therion, Aleister Crowley, makes it advisable for the Fraternity of the Inner Light to define its position in these matters. It will be obvious to anyone who compares these books with each other and with the method that is explained in my book, The Mystical Kabbalah, that the same system is being used in all three. Some explanation is therefore desirable, lest anyone be accused of plagiarism or stealing another person's thunder, or equally be regarded as associated with or representative of one of the others. The explanation is quite simple. All three are drawing from the same source, which I have always referred to as the Western Esoteric tradition. This tradition was reorganized and made available for English students by the late S.L. MacGregor Mathers, into whose hands came a number of cipher manuscripts who had the occult knowledge necessary for their use. He claimed to have got into touch with the sources whence these manuscripts emanated, and there is a certain amount of objective evidence in support of this claim. But the whole subject is wrapped in mystery by the extreme secrecy he observed and by the drastic initiation oaths demanded of all whom he taught what he had learnt, and even to these he was extremely uncommunicative on many vital points. But be that as it may, and whether he came by his system as he said he did, or whether he made it up out of his own head, in actual practice it worked as a highly efficient and satisfactory system of practical occultism and a way of initiation. The proof of the pudding is in the eating in occult affairs. High-sounding titles and limitless claims, such as certain American organizations have accustomed us to in these matters, carry no weight at all with those who have any knowledge of the subject and its history or any practical experience of its workings. It is one of the points in favor of the genuineness of MacGregor Mathers' claims that he wrapped himself in the most impenetrable secrecy and could not be tempted out from his shell, even in self-defense. The evidence concerning the sources from which MacGregor Mathers obtained his manuscripts is, so far as I have been able to sift it, inconclusive and conflicting, and a good deal has been said about those manuscripts which cannot be substantiated. But that those manuscripts exist, I can vouch for as a fact, because I know reliable people who have actually seen them. But as they were in cipher, my informants were not much the wiser, nor could they say how much MacGregor Mathers got out of them and how much he added on as original work. To get accurate information on the subject was not easy, especially as I came on the scene late in the day, after MacGregor Mathers' death, and it was rather like trying to obtain evidence concerning the nature of the cloth from which were made the robes of the king with no clothes on. Everybody pledged their immortal souls as to the truth of the legends that were current in the order that he founded, accepting them uncritically as they circulated by word of mouth and gained authority from much repetition. So far as I could see from what I could learn of the matter and what I saw of the people concerned, MacGregor Mathers had a wide range of rare but not very accurate or profound knowledge, in which professional scholars were able to pick holes. But in him were the roots of the matter, for he saw the mystical and philosophical significance behind what he had reaped in the queer fields of alchemy, the Kabbalah, and Egyptology. To him came, by a curious concatenation of invisible forces that are called chants, the famous cipher manuscripts, and in them he found the formulae which formed the basis of his rituals. These gave him the keys to the queer mass of crazy metaphysical ironmongery which he had already discovered to be a lock. He inserted the psychic key in the metaphysical lock, and lo, it turned and the door of the supernormal consciousness was flung open. How much of these ceremonies were given verbatim in these cipher manuscripts, and how much was contrived by Mathers out of his knowledge, with the aid of the keys with which the manuscripts supplied him, I do not know, but I am quite satisfied, from my experience of them, that the system he worked contained factors quite out of the ordinary, which were not the fruits of pure scholarship, however recondite. If MacGregor Mathers was the sole original author of that system, then he was one of the world's greatest men, but from what I saw of his order, I do not think he was that. The effect of these ceremonies and methods taught by MacGregor Mathers was to produce the most remarkable psychic experiences and extensions of consciousness in those who had any psychic capacity at all. The methods and aim of these processes were intelligently taught in their higher grades in certain sections of this order, and it was possible for those so instructed to produce the results at will, and the effect of repeated experiments was cumulative. They obtained, in fact, by psychic methods, the same results other people achieved by the use of such drugs as hashish and mescal, and without the disastrous after-effects that result from loosening the girders of the mind by physical means. In the light of the experience thus gained, the ancient mysteries became comprehensible, and the possibilities of psychic work thus unfolded were simply limitless. Individual students varied enormously in their capacity to employ the means placed at their disposal. Some were merely futile, some were dry-as-dust scholars, frightened out of their lives of obtaining any practical results from the formulae, and some became genuine adepts with signs following. Among the latter was Aleister Crowley, who has written upon occultism under his own name and various pseudonyms, among other, the Master Therion, Frater P, Perdurabo, and a varied assortment. Some 10 years before I came in touch with Mather's organization, there were wars and rumors of wars. The truth of the matter is hard to come by, but when both sides claim to be angels opposed by devils, it is probably a case of 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. Anyway, as a result of the quarrel, Crowley published the bulk of MacGregor Mather's secrets in his magazine, The Equinox, and Mathers cursed Crowley with bell, hook, and candle. The order suffered severely during the First World War, and Mathers himself died in Paris from influenza during the epidemic. When I came in touch with his organization, it was manned mainly by widows and gray-bearded ancients, and did not appear to be a very promising field of occult endeavor. But I had had considerable experience of practical occultism before I made its acquaintance, and I immediately recognized power of a degree and kind I had never met before, and had not the slightest doubt but that I was on the trail of the genuine tradition, despite its inadequate exposition. For some reason, best known to themselves, the elucidations and interpretations had been withdrawn into the innermost inner by the secret chiefs, who simply sat upon them like broody hens on china eggs. The organization had broken up into a number of disjecta membra, and everybody regarded everybody else with suspicion as not being of the true orthodoxy. I, for my part, took no part in the human pettinesses of the mundane plane, but worked at the system, and the system yielded fruits. Other people, I think, must have done the same, among them Mr. Rigardi. At any rate, in his 2 books, The Garden of Pomegranates and The Tree of Life, he teaches the Golden Dawn system as I learnt it in the various branches of the order of which I have been a member. Mr. Rigardi acknowledges his indebtedness to MacGregor Mathers and Wynne Westcott, but he only quotes from their published works. He quotes so extensively from Crowley, especially from his 4-volume work, Magic, in which is reprinted the best of the Equinox articles and some additional material, and his viewpoint so exactly expresses the best aspects of Crowley's teaching, that I conclude that Crowley's order, the AA, not Mathers' GD, is his source. The AA, however, drew its magical system from the GD. Therefore, for all practical purposes, Rigardi is using the Mathers system, just as I am myself. Rigardi's 2 books I unhesitatingly recommend. The Tree of Life in particular is a magnificent piece of work, in my opinion the best book on magic that has ever been published. Crowley's Magic, of which Rigardi makes much use and to which he acknowledges his indebtedness, is also very valuable to the student, but only the advanced student could use it with profit. It is very uneven in its literary quality, contains much grossness and ribaldry, like all Crowley's writings, and much of it is deliberately obscure and elusive. The formulae, too, on which he works, would be considered averse and evil by occultists accustomed to the Kabbalistic tradition, for he uses 11 instead of 10 as the basis of his batteries of knocks in the magical ceremonies, and 11 is the number of the Qliphoth, or evil Sephiroth. A battery of 11, therefore, is an invocation of the Qliphoth. No hint is given of this in the text, and it is an ugly trap for the unwary student. Crowley also gives the north as the holy point, towards which the operator turns to invoke, instead of the east, whence light arises, as is the classical practice. Now the north is called the place of greatest symbolic darkness, and is only the holy point of one sect, the Yazidis, or devil worshippers. It is obvious, therefore, that the student who is rash enough to experiment with a battery of 11 knocks and an invocation to the north is not going to contact what most people would consider to be desirable forces. Crowley has, however, a remarkable insight into the philosophy of occultism, and when he expounds this, he is a most illuminating writer, and I, for one, would not wish to minimize my debt to his writings. His practical methods, however, are another matter, and are, in my opinion, too dangerous to meddle with in any shape or form. If I read the signs aright, MacGregor Mathers, Crowley, Rigardi, and myself are all working on the same formula, the formula contained in the mysterious cipher manuscripts discovered by Mathers. Rigardi draws from Mathers via Crowley. I imagine, however, that he is alive to the alterations in the formulae that Crowley introduced, for they do not appear in his books, and the formulae he gives are the ones familiar to me in the Golden Dawn workings. These I have found to be sound and effectual. Crowley's version of them I consider to be averse and destructive, though I cannot speak from personal experience on the subject, as I have never had any dealings with this method. I have talked with a number of people who have, however, and there seem to be no two opinions on this point after a sufficient time has elapsed to allow end results to be seen. But while I entirely dissociate myself from Crowley's methods, I would not wish to minimize his contribution to occult literature, which is of the highest value. From his books, the advanced student, who knows how to read between the lines and refine the gold from the dross, can learn an immense amount, and if our interest is limited to an author's writings, we need not concern ourselves with his personal character or private life. One of the most difficult problems in occultism today concerns the question of authority. What constitutes a genuine initiation? In what does a genuine occult order consist? Who and where are the masters? We need to answer all these questions unequivocally and to define standards of judgment before we can put one foot before another on the path. I do not propose in these pages to discuss these questions in detail, for I have done so elsewhere, but I shall make a definite attempt to define a standard of judgment in occult matters that shall enable an opinion to be formed in specific cases. Authority, which is wrapped in mystery, is a thing that is singularly liable to abuse, and it is very difficult to see how, in the absence of persecution, it can have any justification. When occultism had to be pursued at the risk of life and liberty, it was a different matter. But why, in the name of common sense, should any occult organization burrow underground at the present day? Individuals may find it wise to conceal their interest for professional or social reasons, but it is difficult to see why any professed occult teacher should make a secret of his doings, save for the reason that human nature loves a mystery and a modicum of theatricality enhances his prestige. But the dedicated initiator, and none other is worthy of consideration, looks upon esoteric science as a philosophy and a religion, and has no use for such banalities, leaving them to the quack, who finds in mystery-mongering an effectual form of publicity. We may take a sponge, then, and wipe clean off the slate any individual or organization which cannot or will not put the cards on the table and reveal its antecedents. It is an unfortunate thing that popular taste has been fed on occult marvels to such an extent that the wholesome fare of actual fact has become repugnant to it. Unless the spiritual ancestry of an order or an initiator is remote both in time and space, there is no prestige. The charlatan takes advantage of this and reaps the harvest of claims which it is impossible for us to examine, as it is for him to substantiate. Whatever it may be in the East, the lines of contact on the physical plane in the West have been so utterly broken and destroyed with historical time that they have to be pieced together like ancient pottery. Experience proves, however, that when a certain amount of piecing has been done and the pattern appears, it is possible for the psychic to pick up the inner plane contacts and reforge the link. This is what is actually done in the modern mysteries. Because an initiator or an organization claims descent from Himalayan Brotherhood or the Rosicrucians or any other of the much advertised secret orders, it does not follow that descent is by an unbroken line of tradition on the physical plane. Neither does it follow, even if there is no such line of descent, that the claim is invalid. It is possible for an occultist of a certain degree of development to pick up the psychic contacts of these great inner-plane organizations and to be working under their influence. When this occurs, very curious things happen on the physical plane, and the worker finds that he is constantly picking up the broken fragments of the tradition to which he is dedicated. In my own experience, I can see, on looking back, that for at least 3 years before I came in touch with it on the physical plane, I was working on the contacts of the order into which I was finally received. These contacts I also picked up at different points on the 2 occasions when they had been totally severed on the physical plane. One appears to be running on invisible rails when once the contacts of one of the great fraternities had been picked up. There is a large body of testimony to bear witness to this fact. An occult order might be likened to an iceberg, of which 1/7 floats above the surface of the water and the rest is submerged. 6/7 of occult work is performed on the inner planes, and of that, 5/6 consist of subjective experiences. The vital thing, then, for any student or initiator is to have the inner plane contacts of a valid order. Given these, the outer aspect will begin to crystallize around it in the same way as the pearl is laid down layer by layer round the grain of sand in the oyster's shell. But although the inner plane contact is the vital nucleus, any student or an initiator would be in a poor way if he had no body of mundane knowledge to draw upon. The occult systems are too intricate and too detailed for their psychic discernment to be a practical matter. A great body of tradition exists, though scattered and concealed, and the student in whom the inner eye is open can penetrate its significance when he studies it. If he aims at being an initiator and training students, it is necessary that he should codify this knowledge and reduce it to an intelligible system. The value of an occult school depends in large measure on the manner in which this purely mundane work has been done. The ancient wisdom must be correlated with modern thought if its significance is to be made available for the student. An occult school, then, needs to contain psychics who have the living contacts and scholars who have the relevant knowledge. Given these two things, ancient charters are of little significance, for unless the living contacts are there, and unless the system has been kept up to date generation by generation, charters may be nothing but gravestones marking the burial place of a dead faith. Mystical organizations are not long-lived things. They seldom survive the generation that had personal contact with the founder. As soon as the original impulse loses its momentum, senility sets in, and they have to be reborn amid throes unspeakable. Old bottles will seldom hold new wine, and reform usually takes place by schism rather than by expansion and restatement. If we seek the roots of living spiritual experience, we are unwise to look for it along the lines of organized physical plane tradition. The wind bloweth where it listeth, not where it is chartered by established authority. The real line of contact is a personal one, and works in a very peculiar but very definite way. The connecting thread is of the slenderest, yet nevertheless it is there. It is like the grain of leaven that was worked into 7 measures of meal, minute, indispensable, and effectual. This indispensable physical plane link appears to consist in a personal meeting between the seeker and someone who possesses the inner plane contacts. In every record of the foundation of an order, we read of a meeting between its founder and an illuminated teacher who gave him his contacts by virtue of his personal magnetism. Abraham, the father of the spiritual Israel, met that mysterious figure, Melchizedek, who came to him bearing bread and wine for the first Eucharist. Jesus, on the eve of his ministry, sought out John the Baptist, the last of the prophets of Israel. Christian Rosenkreutz traveled to Darnkar, or Damascus, in search of an initiator. Abraham Mellon found the promised instructor among the hermits of the Egyptian desert. Rudolf Steiner met his teacher in the Black Forest. Madame Blavatsky met a certain Indian adept in Kensington Gardens during the Jubilee celebrations. MacGregor Mathers found the mysterious cipher manuscripts and communicated with an address contained therein. But let it be clearly noted that the personal contact with an initiated adept, though the turning point of each career, was no more than a clue that had to be unraveled. Madame Blavatsky had to write her books and build up her organization. MacGregor Mathers used his unique scholarship to give visible body and form to the system of which he received no more than the keys. In each case, the greatness of the work accomplished depended upon the caliber of the worker. There must have been many who contacted the teachers of these great pioneers and no doubt received enlightenment according to their capacity, but who built nothing in the way of an organization and left no mark on the world. Be it noted also that each of the systems thus founded had wrought into their structure the inherent weaknesses of their founders, and these weaknesses formed the lines of fissure along which they ultimately crumbled. Madame Blavatsky had very little discernment where human character was concerned, and though her devotion to her ideals was unquestioned, she was singularly unwise in her policy and unscrupulous in her methods. The Back to Blavatsky movement, in its condemnation of modern theosophy, would do well to remember that the weeds to which they are putting the sickle are but the full growth of the seed she sowed in her unwisdom and lack of principle. MacGregor Mathers, too, who had no other source of income than his esoteric school, steadily weakened it and finally broke it up by his suspiciousness and exclusiveness. From these observed facts, we learn several things that are of importance to us in forming our standard of judgment. We learned, firstly, that physical tradition, save insofar as it consists of the written word which can be studied, is not of supreme importance, because the real value of a long line of spiritual lineage is in the group mind on the inner planes, and this can be picked up by psychic contact, even by those who are not the heirs of the mundane line of inheritance. Moreover, the legal heirs may most lamentably fail to keep the channels open, and so be blind teachers of the blind. Function, not charter, alone gives the right to work the mysteries. Secondly, we learn that it is not enough to cry "Lord, Lord" loudly and persistently. there must be an adequate equipment of scholarship and organization on the physical plane to enable these spiritual forces to find a channel. It has been truly said that the power of endurance of a faith depends entirely upon its literature. All the great faiths have as their nucleus a book, a Bible, a Quran, or the Upanishads. Whatever spiritual teacher relies upon an oral teaching leaves no permanent record behind him. There must be a book, and a mystical or holy book, which speaks, not to reason and intelligence, but to intuition and faith. The specific statements of the neo-theosophical literature of the Besant-Leadbetter school, which attempt to enlighten and convince the conscious mind, are not the center around which the movement founded by Madame Blavatsky is rallying its shattered forces. It is the secret doctrine, which is the sacred book, that will hold the movement together long after the lives of Alcyone have been mercifully forgotten. There must be a book written under the influence of a powerful spiritual inspiration, which forms the permanent nucleus of any movement that is to survive its founder. Such a book exalts the consciousness of those who read it and puts them in psychic touch with the sources whence the inspiration came. They are then able to work independently. People are never satisfied to be spoon-fed indefinitely, and unless a system is able to give them these living contacts, it will fail to hold any but the young souls, and of such a movement cannot be built. It will be interesting to see whether the mass of Rudolf Steiner's writings will afford such a book for his students. I am inclined to doubt whether they are quite of that caliber. MacGregor Mathers left behind him the superb rituals of his Golden Dawn, and these, with their mass of symbolism and magical effectualness, form an inexhaustible mine of inspiration to the initiates of his tradition, which in consequence rekindles its fires whenever there are eyes to see. We have an inspirational nucleus in the cosmic doctrine. We also connect up with the Golden Dawn contacts. It has been our endeavor from the first to make our system self-acting and independent of personal teaching. At the present moment, it is somewhat like an arterial road in course of construction. There are long stretches of broad highway, and there are bottlenecks and narrow bridges where construction work is going on. We believe, however, that we have the necessary nucleus of permanency in our system, and that it will survive the generation that saw its beginning, and permit of the expansion necessary to adapt it to the needs of future generations, because it depends on method rather than on doctrine. Subversive elements in the occult movement. The occult movement has always been an object of suspicion to the powers that be, and not unreasonably so, for the secrecy in which it tries to shroud itself naturally. Naturally attracts more attention than it avoids. Moreover, this very system of secrecy can conveniently be used as a cloak for other things than occultism, and so has been used on many occasions in the past. The occultist, therefore, cannot reasonably resent the suspicion he has aroused, but should endeavor, by all the means available to him, to clarify the situation, give proof of his bona fides, and so conduct his affairs that they shall not afford a cover to evildoers. The influences at work in the world today arrange themselves under two banners, as they have always done. The choice of a banner is a matter of temperament. It has been truly said that everyone is a radical in his youth and a diehard in his old age. We shall always find that the timid and those whom the God of this world has blessed are on the side of conservatism or the maintenance of the present state of affairs. We shall also find that the bolder spirits and those upon whom the prevailing social system presses hardly desire to bring about changes in the order of things, and sometimes radical changes. In both camps, we shall find moderate men and extremists. This is also a matter of temperament. These two contrasting types of temperament have difficulty in understanding each other's viewpoint, and the more extreme examples usually lack the imagination to be able to conceive that there can be a reasonable viewpoint other than their own. Consequently, relations tend to become acrimonious, and each party endows the other with vices it does not possess, or is run by only a small and unrepresentative minority. Self-interest also exasperates the situation, for any gains on the part of one party can only be at the expense of losses to the other. The two camps tend to become armed camps, with a perpetual guerrilla warfare going on between them that occasionally develops into a campaign on a vast scale. Within limits, both aspects are essential to the well-being of the body politic. So clearly has experience proved this, that a well-organized opposition is considered essential to the transaction of national business. But although the normal polarity of viewpoint is a wholesome check on extremes of any kind, and a normal and inevitable development in this universe which manifests through pairs of opposites, there are to be found in both camps extreme viewpoints which pass all bounds of equilibrium, and, to use again the language of the Kabbalists, are qliphothic because they tend towards chaos. The diehard would retain vested interests in his dead hand regardless of changing conditions or the welfare of the world as a whole, and the anarchist, in his disgust with existing conditions, would destroy them from the foundations upward, thus bringing down the house of life on his own head and leaving himself without shelter while the rebuilding is in progress. Reasonable men of both parties regard their own extremists with distrust and are able to give both sympathy and respect to their opponents. As we have already noted, the choice of a party is usually dictated by temperament rather than intellectual conviction. Those who are to be found in the party of change are usually of a more imaginative and impressionable temperament than those who find their spiritual home in conservatism, using the word in its dictionary and not its political sense. It is the same type of person who has an open ear for all things new in any department of the world's activities. He is generally unconventional in dress and diet, wears his hair long when other people wear it short, as in modern times, and short when other people were wearing it long, as among the Roundheads, and reacts violently to his own complexes in general, not only in the things of his especial conviction, but in all his way of life, whether in petty social messages or in the deeper and more fundamental things of the spirit. Occultism being more than most things an unconventional viewpoint, we find among its adherents a high percentage of the liberal-minded and comparatively few of those with a conservative or conventional outlook. We must not, however, commit the logical fallacy of confusing post hoc with propter hoc. People do not become radical in their views because of any doctrines taught them under the veil of secrecy in occult lodges, but become occultists because they are of the open-minded and adventurous type. There is, moreover, a certain type of the more philosophic reformer who, in seeking an explanation which shall direct him to the root causes of social discontent, finds that the esoteric teachings afford that explanation, especially in their doctrines concerning group minds, subtle influences, and evolutionary cycles. Such a social reformer studies occultism not for the purpose of applying ritual magic to his enemies, as a popular imagination supposes, but in order to understand root causes. It is rare to find the fanatic of either party in occult circles, or, for the matter of that, in any circles that do not see eye to eye with him. He has such a one-way mind, and is so concentrated on his special prepossession that he is not interested in anything else, and has no time to waste on it. It will be seen, then, that although people with advanced and unconventional viewpoints unquestionably predominate in occult circles, they do so incidentally and temperamentally, and not because the occult doctrines are immediately concerned with politics. Occultism and the Underworld. Apart from what might be termed the genuine and sincere association with occultism with subversive persons and ideas which is purely accidental, depending upon the fact that the same type of temperament takes to both lines of interest, it cannot be denied that inextricably mixed in with the occult movement is a dangerous underground line of subversive activity, and the authorities do well to keep a watch on it. The peculiar and quite needless secrecy observed by occultists make the occult movement a very handy cloak for various activities that will not bear inspection. Scotland Yard is quite alive to this fact, and keeps a sharp eye on all occult organizations in consequence. The semi-public, semi-private nature of their proceedings fits them singularly well to the purpose of persons whose activities are under surveillance in their customary haunts. Any esoteric organization which is asked to allow letters to be sent in its care, or to receive parcels from printers to be called for by private car, or even to allow its telephone to be used by strangers, ought to be on its guard. It is an open secret that the letters of suspects are examined and that their telephone calls are listened to. Consequently, it is of great importance to such persons to find unsuspected places where they can receive communications. There can very seldom be a good reason for not having letters sent to an accommodation address, and esoteric organizations which are complacent in this matter make difficulties for the whole movement. It is a very unfortunate thing that the Theosophical Society became so intimately associated with Indian political activities, though in justice it must be said that there was probably no reaction of what extremes these activities would ultimately lead to. Many people in consequence look upon all occult movements as being tarred with the same brush and fear that they will be involved in all manner of complications if they become associated with them, and therefore limit their studies to the theory of esoteric science and find no opportunity for experience of its practice. The fascistically inclined organizations of Great Britain seem to take the menace of subversive occultism very seriously, and to consider that an occult society is ipso facto subversive and as such to be spied upon. No reasonable person should object to being inspected by the authorized representatives of law and order because his own interests are protected in the doing so, but the amateur detective is an offensive nuisance, and as such must expect just as short shrift as the Bolshevik. The pan played by drug addiction in the seamy side of occultism has been greatly overrated. The drugs used are of the vision-producing type, such as anhelonium and hashish, and these are not drugs of addiction in the West. In the quantities in which they are used for occult experiments, they are unlikely to do permanent harm. The drugs to which people become addicts are those which either produce exhilaration and immunity to fatigue, or those which deaden consciousness and make a troubled life more bearable. Under neither of these headings are to be found any of the vision-producing drugs. No one is likely to induce vision by their use sufficiently frequently to run any risk of addiction, and in any case, anhelonium is not habit-forming. The risk to which these drugs expose those who use them is psychic, not physical. They may, if the experimenter is not an expert occultist, thoroughly competent in sealings and banishings, lay their user open to psychic invasion and even obsession because they open the doors of the astral to the unprepared consciousness. And as every swimmer knows, it is one thing to swim out and another to swim back. I am not prepared to deny that they have a place in occult research, but such research should only be undertaken by those who are properly equipped, both as to their occult and their scientific attainments, and is in every way undesirable when done by those who are merely seeking a new thrill. A great deal has been made by fiction writers of the Black Mass, which consists of desecrating by every means that an overwrought imagination can suggest the sacred symbols of the Catholic faith. It is a procedure limited for all practical purposes to Roman Catholics, because, as Eliphas Levi pointed out, no one can partake of a Black Mass effectually who does not fervently believe in a White Mass. To the nonconformist, the operations of a Black Mass would be senseless. Sexual orgies have played a part in the mysteries, and in the case of primitive peoples, we must not be too ready to condemn indiscriminately without considering the type of society in which they take place. Civilized standards cannot be used to judge primitive folk living under entirely different conditions and codes to ourselves. These orgies by no means necessarily produce the degeneration that missionaries would have us believe. They are by no manner of means the same thing as general sexual promiscuity, but are strictly limited to certain periods. A people living under natural conditions in the most intimate touch with nature and competing with plant and animal for the possession of the soil has other social needs and consequently other moral standards than a highly organized, dense population whose problem is to feed itself from a limited area. To the former, the orgies that stimulate fecundity may be as necessary and virtuous as the moral restraints of other types of society. Nor must we make the mistake of thinking that because a race has either explicit or symbolic representations of the organs of reproduction among its sacred symbols, it is necessarily licentious, any more than the fact that a nun is admitted to a religious order with a marriage ceremony should lead us to suspect the same thing. Reticence in sexual questions is a matter of manners, not of morals. There are truths in these things that we cannot ignore, and civilization is the poorer and by no means either the cleaner or the healthier for ignoring them. The trouble comes, however, when people who are licentiously inclined use them as a justification and a cloak. A certain amount of this has been done, especially on the continent, in the name of occultism. For the most part, however, the loose living in occult circles consists in a somewhat freely circulating assortment of soulmates, and has no more occult significance than similar conditions in artistic circles. No magical use is made of the relationships. The only occult touch they have lies in the finding of justification for them in past lives, which no one except the persons concerned takes very seriously. Various occultists at different times have attempted to put into practice the Freudian doctrines. No one with any insight into life can deny that there is a very large measure of truth in these doctrines, and that, theoretically, much justification can be found for the doings of such initiators. The social consequences and the general strain of upheaval of such methods are, however, so serious that whatever one may think of them from the point of view of pure science, in actual practice they are better left alone. For one thing, the forces employed get out of hand extremely easily, and when such practices are done in group formation, the group mind takes on an atmosphere much too elemental to be tolerated by civilized people. Orgies and crude sexual magic have passed away from the level of consciousness at which civilized races function, just as infanticide and the despatch of the aged have passed away. There are other and better methods of approaching the elemental levels of consciousness than these which do not belong to the right-hand path. By purely psychological methods, the psychoanalyst achieves the same result, but it is only when the experience of the psychoanalyst is united to the knowledge of the esotericist that the deeper issues and supremest heights are reached. At one time, there was a widespread use of abnormal vice for magical purposes. The facts are well known and gave rise to repeated scandals. There is nothing to be said in mitigation of such practices. They are unnatural and destructive on every plane. There is reason to believe, however, that this phase of black occultism has had its day and is dying out. The principal exponent became hopelessly insane, and his example appears to have taught wisdom to such of his followers as had not learnt it from experience. Nevertheless, there remains a great deal of very unsound teaching and practice in certain circles, which produces a rich crop of psychopathologies. Group minds have become tainted, and sensitive individuals are liable to very unpleasant experiences, to much psychic disturbance, and even to actual illness through association with them. The leaders of these groups are by no means given over to evil, but they have very little understanding of the forces with which they have been contacted. The repeated outbreaks of psychic trouble in their midst they attribute to occult attack from outside, or to the retaliation of the forces of evil against which they are contending, and do not realize that they are like people who have built their houses on the slopes of a volcano. However, it is probable that, with the breakdown of the leader, the atmosphere will gradually clear, and that which is of value will be disencumbered of the many unfortunate elements that have gathered about it. The Jewish peril. There has always been a strong anti-Semite feeling among the continental nations, though in these islands it is of a very modified type. There have been books published recently which have set out to show that the revolution in Russia is the work of the Jews, and that the Jewish race as an organized unit is out to destroy civilization. Among these books are some which attempt to prove specifically that the Jewish initiate is a particularly dangerous person, and that any occult movement in which a goodly portion of Jews finds a place must be a particularly dangerous movement. In order to examine the rights and wrongs of this proposition, we must first examine the basis on which it rests. What is the cause of the general antagonism to the Jew? Most people would say it is because they slew our Lord, but the real answer to this question is probably to be found in the fact that there is a higher percentage of intellectual acuteness and ability, and a lower percentage of the marital virtues among the Jewish people than among most other races. This, together with his racial pride and exclusiveness, irritates the Gentile, and as the Jew is seldom a warlike person, the irritation can safely be given free vent. Moreover, owing to his peculiar gift for finance, the Jew is the universal moneylender, and a very convenient way of putting paid to inconvenient debts is to have an occasional pogrom. Both parties possess strengths and weaknesses which makes them feared by and yet a prey to each other. Such a state of affairs cannot be productive of mutual trust and good feeling. It is perfectly true that in Bolshevism, and for the matter of that, in anarchical circles in general, there is a high percentage of Jews. The reason for this is not far to seek. The Jew is an exception to the general rule that an idealist is never practical. When an idealistic movement wants an efficient organizer, it generally fails to find it among the Gentiles in its ranks. The Jews have been the backbone of the Bolshevist movement for the simple reason that the Russian, left to himself, cannot organize and is hopelessly impractical. Therefore, the Jewish element has come to the front. This is not peculiar to the Bolshevist movement. Peter the Great, when reforming the Russian administration and founding the state upon modern lines, found it necessary to import German administrators for the simple reason that then, as now, the Russians could not organize or administer. The Jew comes to the front in revolutionary circles, as he does in literary and scientific circles, owing to the high percentage of ability and driving power to be found in his race. Again, post hoc is not propter hoc. The Jew is attracted to the Western esoteric tradition because it is based on the Kabbalah, the mystical wisdom of Israel, and because his intellect is of a type which takes kindly to esoteric philosophy. There appears to be a complete lack of the mystical element in Judaism today, save in relation to Jewish nationalism. For women, indeed, this is especially marked, for they have no place in the Jewish religion save as the carriers out of the Levitical customs that apply to the home. This lack seems to be keenly felt by the more thoughtful Jew, who feels the need of the kind of mysticism that Christianity teaches but cannot accept the Christ. He, and especially she, find this mysticism in occultism without any exclusive religious bias and are able to adapt it to that which they honor in the tradition of Israel. Consequently, there are many Jews in Western occultism, and as always, they come to the front because of their intellectual capacity and driving force. It cannot be but obvious to anyone who looks at the matter in the light of history and racial psychology that the Jewish race, as a race, has more to lose than any other by social upheaval and disorder, for they are the moneylenders of the world, and the first thing any nation does after a revolution is to wipe out back debts, both private and national. The Jewish race are, moreover, non-military. Not that there are not individual fighting men among the Jews, as the history of pugilism shows, but their peculiar religious tenets as applied to social customs make an army very difficult, if not impossible, to organize. Upon one occasion, Jerusalem was stormed because the Jews would not work at its defenses on the Sabbath. There is no question, however, but that men of Jewish race have played an important part in determining the course of history by giving or withholding the sinews of war from bellicose monarchs and governments. This, however, has not been a matter of organized national policy, but of personal speculation and venture, at any rate since governments have ceased to force the Jew to lend money upon the security of his own back teeth. It is noteworthy that the record of the Jewish statesman is singularly clean. He serves the nation of his adoption with a single-minded integrity and conspicuous ability. The Jew has always been prominent in Western occultism. In fact, he was for centuries its only guardian, for the Church put down all speculation and experiment in spiritual things with a firm hand. The Kabbalah has been the chief outlet for the spiritually minded Jew who found phylacteries barren things, and the Kabbalah has ceremonial magic and a highly technical psychism as its practical applications. In Israel is to be found the fountainhead of the Western tradition. In fact, Western occultists need to have a working knowledge of the elements of the Hebrew language in order to disentangle the barbarous jargon of dog Hebrew, which is the heritage of unscholarly lodges. The fanatic who has got it firmly fixed in his head that the Jewish race is bent upon the destruction of all social order looks upon it as one of the clearest proofs of the guilt of occultism that a Jewish element and influence is to be found therein. May we remind them, however, that the same may be said of Christianity, which has its cultural roots in Judaism. From the historical point of view, Abraham, rather than Peter, holds the keys of heaven for the Western world. Esoteric tradition admits of no exclusiveness. It is the very essence of its spirit that blasphemes no God that has been hallowed by man's devotion. It sees all religions as the expressions of man's spirit rather than the personal revelation of a jealous God to his chosen people. It suffers from neither superstitious awe nor bigoted feet. When asked to take sides in any acrimonious dispute concerning ultimate rights and wrongs, it says, "A plague on both your houses." The way of God is the way of the lightning flash, zigzagging between the pillars, and the place of equilibrium is in the central point of the central pillar.